thank you all for coming to tonight's event, despite the pandemic and all the distractions that we have going on today. So, thank you, Leslie, for setting up tonight's event, and thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to speak to you here today, and for all those at home that may be watching later on. I'm here to talk about forests, and I'm going to use the example of the particular issue of wildfire to talk about forests. But I'm not going to talk about it in the way in which you're familiar. So if I was going to give you a presentation on wildfire, what I could talk about is the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy, which has been around for over 5 years. It's the gold standard for wildfire management nationally. If you're really interested in wildfire, I really recommend that you look into it. And if I was telling you about that, I would share this structure around the 3 main ingredients for addressing catastrophic wildfire around resilient landscapes, safe and effective wildfire response, and fire-adapted communities. And then I would talk about the involvement of that cohesive wildfire strategy and how the Oregon governor convened a wildfire council on wildfire response in 2019 with leaders from across all sectors of Oregon, and how that council delivered at the end of last year a 118-page report with 37 recommendations for how to build off the cohesive wildfire strategy around wildfire suppression, mitigation, and adaptation and recovery. But the main headline of all that work is actually pretty simple, which is that the scientists and the foresters generally agree about what needs to change on the ground in order to address catastrophic wildfire. The problem, though, is not that we don't have solutions. We have solutions. We've got recommendations. We've got plans. The problem is we don't have the social will to support that work. So what my talk is going to focus on here today is really social change. And to illustrate that, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, this is a fictional story, but it's illustrative. So this is Claudia. Claudia is a Latina mother of 2, born and raised 5 miles north of Santa Rosa, California. She volunteers as a community organizer in Sonoma County to fight for clean air and water for her children. She and her partner lost their home in the 2017 Tubbs fire in California, and in October of last year, and this year again, the house they rebuilt was threatened, and they had to evacuate to avoid harm. Claudia's tired. She's tired of every summer worrying about a wildfire season that stretches on and on, tired of smoke inundating the community, and now with COVID-19, when the outdoors are really the only place of refuge for her and her family, she's concerned that wildfire is forcing them indoors and into greater risk of infection. She's ready to direct her coalition to do something, but she doesn't know exactly what. So Claudia, like a lot of us, when she's got a question, she Googles it. And she does a Google search, and what she finds out is a lot of information on the problem, but not a lot of information on solutions, let alone how she and someone like her and her community can engage in solving that problem. However, based on her search history and the accounts that she follows, World Forestry Center serves her a targeted Instagram ad featuring a city council member that she already knows and who is speaking at an upcoming pop-up event just 20 minutes from her house. So Claudia goes to the event, which is sponsored by the World Forestry Center, Filson, and the California Department of Public Health. The city council member representing her district discusses how wildfire disproportionately impacts communities of color, and how the inequities of both direct impacts of wildfire as well as the inequities of secondary impacts, such as power outage, impact that community. State community health experts and foresters talk about the health impacts of wildfire smoke, and how mechanical thinning and prescribed fires can reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. After sharing her community organizing efforts with some of the World Forestry Center staff, she's encouraged to apply for a scholarship to attend the annual World Forestry Center Summit in Portland. Now, this is a multi-sector summit bringing decision makers in forest management together with influencers in communities impacted by wildfire. While Claudia is at that event, she hears from government officials, meets other community organizers, and explores experiences at the newly redesigned World Forestry Center the World Forestry Center's Experience Center, including a virtual reality simulation showing how controlled burns and mechanical thinning can reduce the health risks of catastrophic wildfire. After the summit, Claudia has provided a toolkit for how she can be involved and engage her community in the wildfire policymaking in California and nationally. And back at home, she continues to use this toolkit and strengthens her relationships and partnerships with other community organizers and influencers that she met during her visit. So this is a watershed event for Claudia. And she goes on to be a leading voice for marginalized communities in the wildfire discussion, who, when combined with a broad coalition of new voices, provide the public support necessary for decision makers to adopt policies that dramatically increase the state, federal, and private investment in our forests. And in doing so, allow the forests to return to their historic resilience to wildfire and improves the health of Claudia's community. Now, this story is set in California. Actually, the development of this story was early last year. But in the wake of the Labor Day fires here in Oregon, this could just as much be set with Claudia living in Talent, Oregon, which was devastated in the most recent wildfires here. So, why is this a fictional story? This is a fictional story because the history of forestry and forest management has been a history of the few. Whether you're talking about extractive interests of the early 20th century or strict preservation interests of the latter 20th century. I kind of refer to both this as sort of the forest nerds. But today, the approach to forests is more balanced, and it can be even more sustainable. But in order to do so, what we need is that this conversation cannot just be around an interest of the few. It has to be the interest of the many. Now, the good news is that we have major forces that are driving awareness that our future is linked to the future of our forests like never before. Whether you're talking about last year with the fires in the Amazon and capturing the world's attention, emphasizing that we can't just life hack our way to addressing climate change without shoring up our existing forest management. Or COVID-19 and this year's wildfire season, where natural disasters have direct health impacts, but also secondary health impacts that force people indoors into crowded spaces. Or investment in affordable housing, such as mass timber, which can provide scalable housing solutions that are better for our environment and for our communities. The challenge is that awareness by itself is not enough. A healthier society, whether you're talking about managing forests on a massive scale to reduce catastrophic wildfire, creating affordable, eco-friendly housing for our communities with mass timber, or slowing climate change by sequestering carbon in wood and preventing the massive release of carbon in wildfires. Society must have the will to invest in the actions on a much greater scale than we've done before. So what we're talking about here is really sort of the bridge, right? If you look at this, it's sort of awareness, social will, and action on the ground. And the missing piece here, because we've got a lot of plans and ideas of what the action would be. And we have a lot of general awareness among the public about important issues. But the missing piece here is that social will. But what if there was a place that had a single-minded focus on building that will? An organization that is shaping a world where people from all walks of life embrace sustainable forestry's role in a balanced, equitable future? An organization where the market focused on creating a marketplace for thriving, durable, and diverse sustainable forestry products that make a lasting balance possible. A world where society supports policies that build the foundation for healthier forests and a healthier society. An organization already located at a global epicenter of the forestry world, whether you're talking about family forestry companies, TIMOs, environmental advocates, mass timber manufacturers, green architects, and world-class forestry academics. And an organization already located in a place where the culture is distinctly forest-centric. A place where the forests have been part of the identities of the community, now historically really around it being the economic backbone, but today it's the modern day branding backbone of recreation. World Forestry Center could be that place. We have 50 years of engaging society to shape our forests, and 50 years of building relationships within the forestry sector at the local, national, and international level. We have people at the center of our mission, and now we have a vision that is focused on building society's will to act at the center of our work. And when I talk about society's willingness to act, action is really measured in two different ways. It's how people spend their money, and it's how they support policies. Now, we're talking about building societal will. The truth is, the World Forestry Center has never engaged in doing this work at this scale before. What we've done is general awareness and education, sure, but not this laser focus on building that will for society to take action. So, when I came on, what we did is we asked the experts. So early this last year, we convened a group of experts, an impressive group of social change folks who have done this at scale many times before with backgrounds in business, policy, forestry, and civil society. And what came out of that was we really sort of asked, how does societal change happen? So actually, let me, yeah. And we sort of looked at, this is an existing model for social change. So we're not reinventing the wheel. It's just that oftentimes when we talk about natural resources, we don't talk about social change. And if you look across, this is sort of an established model for social change. It happens at the individual level, it happens at the collective level. It's a combination of feeling and thinking. You need stories to engage. You need programs to demonstrate. You need markets and advocacy to scale. And that's how you end up with social change. So if you do a gap analysis, essentially in the forestry realm, what you see is there's some big gaps. There's a gap in terms of the messaging. There's some sort of head thinking stories, but not a lot of hard stories. There's a messenger gap. Most of the people that are talking about forests are already invested in that subject area. So they really aren't people that are already trusted by sort of the general public. And then last, there's an advocacy and marketing gap. There's a lot of great innovation work happening in those sectors, but there's a lack of coordination. There's a lot of opportunity to be left on the table by folks engaged in those conversations. So what came out of that conversation was, and I just realized one thing that we don't have in here, it was the audience around this conversation is really the practical center. That's the core audience. That's the missing piece of getting the scale to really sort of build that social will. So if you look at those gaps and you say, okay, we're going to engage the practical center, we're going to address those gaps, what was identified was sort of, well, World Forestry Center could address those gaps by serving these three roles. Now the main role, the key role, is this narrative driver component, driving emotional, logical, and an actionable narrative about forestry by trusted voices. But then there's a marketplace accelerator gap. That's what I talked about, sort of that opportunity being left on the table. And last, there's this policy catalyst. So the way I look at this is, if you just do the narrative driver component, you just measure inputs, dollars spent, campaigns run, right? But the key is around that narrative driver and that storytelling is it has to be tied to actions on the ground, changes in policy, changes in markets. That's when you start measuring outputs. And if there's people in here that are, business and policy dorks, that will really resonate. I'm going to show you another model. So this model has existed previously, just often not talked about the natural resource space. Where the World Forestry Center has existed is here in the lower left, right? So it's around driving awareness around the public. What we're talking about moving into is really that center space that's really around building societal will with influencers. There's a lot of people down in the lower left space. There's a lot of people in the upper right focused on action, really, litigation, lawmaking with decision makers. But there's this missing component, this essential link that's really necessary, that no matter, you come up with the best policy you want with decision makers and birth that into a political environment, and what you realize is you don't have the larger social will to support the investment needed to create the action on the ground at the scale and pace necessary to address the issue. You literally cannot get ahead of the wildfire. So, what does this work look like? Well, what you saw here today when I showed that story was just an example, right? So you have an influencer, you have a community organizer in a community. You create you don't sort of just speak on high, you go and find out where they are, you engage them, you bring them in, you create experiences that engage, empower, and bring those people into the conversation. So, and when you create those experiences around this experience art, it's an intentional piece all the way through for that individual influencer. And then when you do that across a variety of different influencers, that sort of forms the basis of this program. So these journeys taken together across those influencers set your experience plan. So you have a critical mass of that practical center moving from awareness to action. So that's just, I wanted to give you an example here today of how we're thinking about this at the World Forestry Center. How you can create a more sustainable forestry future by inviting people in, driving the conversation, and in the end, creating the social change that we need at scale to support the solutions that the experts generally agree on. And so with that, what I'm going to do is end with a little video.
All right.
Is it going to work if I just click it?
Sure.
All right. And well, I'll take questions right after.
Forests. The story of humanity has been tied to them. They provide us with clean air and water, places to recreate, reflect, and restore, and essential products that shape our health, our prosperity, our way of life. When society and force are in balance, each can flourish. And when they are not, both suffer. Today, major forces are shifting this balance. An ever-growing population, a changing climate, catastrophic wildfire. It is clearer than ever that our fate is tied to the fate of our forests. Innovations in science, business, and technology provide hope. New methods in growing, harvesting, and replanting trees. Construction that is kinder to the environment and to society. Policies that allow healthy wildfire to return to the landscape. Investment in the full benefits of tree. However, awareness and innovation alone are not enough. Society must have the will to act. World Forestry Center is building that will. Join us in expanding our community, empowering new voices, and driving the actions that create healthier forests, and in turn, a healthier society.
So the story of Claudia sort of illustrates that. So it's events and experience that help shape society, right? And in society, the method is you don't have to reach everybody. It's really, there's this key group of the influencers who really folks look to form their opinions. And so anybody who's been involved, I know we got someone who was involved recently in a political campaign, You know, there's this theory of sort of how you reach people, how you engage people exists in all different levels. It's just oftentimes in the natural resource world, our theory of change has been, I know what needs to happen, you just need to listen. And so the difference is around creating the events and experiences that engage those publics. So we talked about the Experience Center, so changing the World Forestry Center from a passive museum space to an experience center around that stuff, and then building virtual experiences that extend long before people show up in person and long after. So when I spoke earlier around the cohesive wildfire strategy and by extension the Oregon Wildfire Council, anytime you talk about addressing catastrophic wildfire, it's sort of three things. It's prevention, so you have to have the ability to address wildfire that may impact communities. You can't just sort of treat forests and remove that possibility. You're going to still have to have a capacity to put out fires. The second is adaptation and recovery, which is the impacts of wildfires. The truth is that wildfire existed on the landscape long before we showed up. What we have is 100 years of suppressing wildfire, and combined with managing those forests based on a certain management regime that no longer is taking place. So in the case of Oregon, roughly the mitigation committee, their analysis was roughly 60% of the high-risk acres in Oregon are on federal lands. And a lot of cases of federal lands have been managed in the past for timber harvest. In the late 1990s, that timber harvest was reduced by 90%. So a combination of not having wildfire as part of the landscape so that it would cause the species diversity that would be resilient to wildfire. So when wildfire came through, it'd be low level, low heat, low flame height. It would clean out the underbrush. It would be a restorative part of the normal processes. And one thing I'll just say on the side is not all forests are equal. So when we're talking about forests in eastern Oregon versus forests on western Oregon, they have different regimes as to how fire interacted on that landscape. Okay, so so if you take the frame, and this is one of the big, I'll just use an example. You cannot talk about wildfire without addressing prevention, adaptation, recovery, and mitigation. Mitigation is the last piece, which is around managing forests. Yeah. And so then your question is sort of what role would clear cuts play? Well, I think clear cuts, and it depends on the landscape, but clear cuts can serve a prevention role, or an adaptation role rather, and they can serve as a fire break, right? So if you look at a lot of communities where wildfires occurring, they are, in certain cases, they're creating a fire break, right? So if you're talking about housing in the wild-urban interface that's right up against these forests, you need to create a fire break, you need to manage fuel load on your land. And so when wildfire time comes, it reduces the impact. In most cases, the actual mitigation actions that are needed in the forest right now, and in particular around federal lands, is a reduction of small diameter wood. So this is wood that's under 10 inches that doesn't have a lot of commercial value, maybe biomass, but that's about it. The question as to those treatments and whether or not there is some room for some additional harvest of mercantile wood along with that treatment, that's sort of a place-based question that needs to be answered depending on the particular forest and the particular area. But in most cases, when we're talking about mitigation, managing forests to reduce wildfire, we're talking about taking those younger age class trees that were planted in a context in which you were going to grow them up, you were going to manage them, then you were going to take trees off. They've now grown so that you have a fuel load that when it ignites the crowns of the older trees. You know, the Nature Conservancy has been doing some really interesting work down in southwestern Oregon, focused around spotted owls. And what they realized is in many cases, the best thing they could do for the spotted owls was to go in and cut some of the smaller trees that if they ignited, would take out some of the old growth trees that were serving as habitat for spotted owl. So in the larger theory, this is called sort of adaptive restoration, in which you sort of manage the landscape towards the particular values that you have interest for. So the comment, I'll just summarize it real quickly. So the comment was really around the evolving relationship between society and natural resource use, in particular wood. And in the built environment, how that changes over time, sometimes very quickly, within decades. Where during a certain period in the building of buildings, there would be a preference for steel to the point of painting wood to look like steel, to maybe today where wood is favored in terms of aesthetic qualities and you take the paint off. And now sort of the innovations around mass timber, which is really about a disruption of the construction world, where you have innovations in cross-laminated timber is just one of a number of mass timber technologies that are resilient to fire, that provide all types of opportunities when combined with artificial intelligence and modular technology, in which you're able to. There's some really exciting work that's being done by Sidewalk Labs. We have a member of the head of building innovation for Sidewalk Labs is now on our board. This is a Alphabet company, so the Alphabet is the parent company of Google. Right. And it's really, of course, mass timber, they care about it because, yeah, it has benefits for the climate and carbon impacts. But really, what they're really excited about it is they're talking about, because you don't have to worry for the cure time related to concrete, they're able to reduce the total amount of time it takes to construct a building by 75%. And anybody who builds a building knows that 50% of your cost is the time it takes to build the building. So if you can reduce the amount of time, the logistics stream, and then there's all types of opportunities around the modularity of the structure, and there's some exceptional innovations around how we live and how we interact in our building. And by the way, 50% of our carbon impact roughly comes from our buildings. So how we manage our buildings impacts us every day. What's weird, I'll just use this as an analogy, because you asked sort of strategies around how we change the paradigm and how we make an impact. Portland, Oregon hosts the largest international mass timber conference in the world every year. World Forestry Center hosts the largest international timber investment conference every year. Almost no one goes to both conferences. So last year I invited some people from there to come to our conference. We featured Kareem Khalif from Sidewalk Labs at our virtual version of that conference, School in the Forest, this year. Because the people in the mass timber world, kind of, besides looking downstream to the service providers, they live largely in the construction world. And even if you look at the money side, the people that finance buildings are different than the people that finance timberland investment. Right? One's pension funds, maybe even though from a legal standpoint, there's a lot of real estate analogs between TMOs and REITs. I won't get into that, sorry. Legal dork moment. But there's so much of the solutions around innovations. When you look back in history, right? If you look back to 19th century Paris, or you look back at any time in which you have intellectual sort of a jump, a lot of it has to do with unconventional partnerships to develop around breaking down conventional barriers. We're tribal. We kind of, people who think like us, and we get in the same room, and we end up having the same conversation. And really the future of forestry and the future around engaging and expanding this conversation is around breaking down those walls, creating that alchemy around those partnerships, and reaching out to engage the larger public. Because once we get into this conversation around clear cuts, or how much treatment versus prevention, all that stuff, it gets down into sort of the people that have always been involved in that discussion. And the problem is, when we talk about a lot of these solutions of wildfire, climate change, they cross over into what I call general fund issues, right? This is about public health. This is about the future of our children. This is about our economy. And it can't be just sort of a conversation around sort of the tree nerds. It has to reach out to the larger public and look for opportunities to engage people that are the best and the brightest in their particular area, where you're talking about finance, or where you're talking about legal innovation, or you're talking about science. That's happening. There's places this is happening right now. And I think the role of the World Forestry Center in this is really around that narrative driver piece in particular, the storytelling that engages those influencers and that ties it together. Well, the comment was in part sort of one of the things that I touched on in the presentation, where I talked about the World Forestry Center and what if there was a place that was at an epicenter of the forestry world. And that is still really true today. You know, in the United States, we've got a tremendous amount of timber that is grown in the southeast. But still, in terms of you're going to go to one place and you're going to find not just experts in how you do milling, but experts in terms of how you genetically grow trees, experts in terms of mass timber, experts in terms of forestry academics, experts in terms of the most successful environmental advocates and litigators, and Lewis Clark and some of my fellow classmates are here. That's all here in Portland, Oregon. And so there's a real opportunity. This isn't just about Portland, Oregon, right? It's the World Forestry Center. But the truth is, if you talk to someone today about what value they get from their timber, there's a bunch of microeconomics and there's some macroeconomics that stretch across seas. A lot of technologies that are employed in sawmills today have been adopted in the late 1990s, early 2000s from Finland and Europe. So I think we've got an opportunity here in Portland, Oregon, little Portland, Oregon, to really sort of develop this concept, grow it, and expand it to have an impact not just regionally in the West, nationally, but internationally. So the question was around the role of forests in terms of water quality. And in particular, an example was given here in the Northwest. Many of the water supplies for urban centers come from forested area. In many cases, they're actually owned by the municipality that manage that specific watershed for water quality. The question was, of that one value, which is water quality, and I would, in this case, water quantity as well, how do you manage that versus other competing values? And I think this is one of the challenges around forestry and for the sort of discussions around forestry is that it is a multiple use topic, and I think that each forest has to be evaluated based on the values that forest can best provide. In the case of your forests in your watershed that's providing your drinking water, you're going to manage specifically for that use. The management of that landscape may look different than the management landscape for spotted owls. It definitely looks different than how you manage that landscape in terms of sort of 40-year-old timber that goes into timber production. There is no one forest use or forest value that should be applied to all the forests across the landscape. And so that's, when you talk about this is like 101 stuff with forests, and the forest folks, that's, of course, this is how you think about forests. But often how it's sort of birthed in a larger conversation is one of which either, the only good tree is one that's cut on a truck, or that, it's a affront to humanity and God to ever cut a tree down. I mean, there is a multiple use aspect to our forests. So to answer your question about specifically drinking water, that's managed in a way differently than sort of commercial private timber ground. I will point out though, that one of the reasons why I focus on wildfire here, and why I think wildfire is one of the issues that's a great uniter, is no matter what issue you care about, catastrophic wildfire, not sort of restorative wildfire at the historic level, but catastrophic wildfire has a negative impact on almost all those values. So, for example, in the Ashland watershed, they charge a fee with all their water bills, which pays for a forester to go out and cut trees to manage that landscape for resilience to wildfire. So when that wildfire occurs in that landscape, and then based on the weather models and that landscape, wildfire is going to be happening there. They can't stop all the wildfires. There's going to be lightning strikes, there's going to be wildfire. So how do you manage those forests and that drinking watershed to be as resilient as possible to wildfires? So anyway, I hope that answers the question. these, when you get into values like carbon, and you look across the landscape, I really think you have to take, I'm going to use a portfolio approach. There are certain constants that go into that equation, which I spoke to here. Population growth is happening. Despite the pandemic, it's still not making a dent in our population. Climate change is happening. So the way that I personally think about how we approach our natural resources is how do we make them as resilient and restorative as possible in the face of those constants. And I think that we are still just discovering how powerful forests can be in terms of all types of values. I recently watched a special, I don't know if anyone else has watched it, I think it's on Netflix, very interesting, around mushrooms. And this is not necessarily an endorsement for the most recent initiative that passed around legalizing the use of certain mushrooms for their medicinal qualities. But there is a lot of research that's gone into the fact that mushrooms are have a connection and relationship to forests and have all types of benefits. I mean, you hear about just another way in which the rainforest has produced another compound that has incredible medicinal qualities. So I think the forest, I think there's been a tremendous amount of work done to date that shows all the different ways in which forests can be restorative. And I think there's much more to come. And I think what we have to, we have to raise the level of discourse around our forests to reflect the complexity and benefits that they provide. So this is really a land use, well, okay, so there's a constitutional component of that question, but so there's a Fourth Amendment takings point of that question, and then there's also local law. So in the case of Oregon, I'm just going to use this in the case of Oregon, right, because we know Oregon well. So Oregon has its own special land use system that incorporates a variety of different values into those land use decisions. So generally, it's known as a more restrictive district for development. The question really is one around wildfire and the wild-urban interface. And if you see more and more people impacted by wildfire, some of that is the fact that we're having more wildfires and they're more destructive. But it is also because more and more people are building into that space such that there isn't the fire breaks, right? They're living there because they love the forest. I mean, who doesn't? That's an active debate. When you look at adaptation and recovery, there's people there's a variety of different, and you can see this actually in the Oregon Wildfire Council's report on the adaptation and recovery section has a number of recommendations. So some of it is around how do you build those houses? And so there's actually a great article that was in the New York Times, I think it was New York Times or Wall Street Journal last year, of a fire down in California where you just see this scorched landscape. Right. And there's one house, and there isn't any trees around it, but the house is fine. And it's because that person's paid the 30% additional cost to essentially engineer that house to be resistant to wildfire. Yeah. I think it's I may be wrong about this, someone could correct me, but there's an art museum down in the LA area that has had a number of wildfires around it recently. And it has been unaffected by those wildfires. Because when they built it, they specifically anticipated that was going to be sort of the norm. So there's a lot of people talk about sort of armoring houses. There's a lot of work that can be done in buildings, not just in terms of the management of the fuel loads around the house, but actually what products you use in building the house and how it's engineered to make it more resilient to wildfires. That's the unfortunate sort of headline, is that we're going to have smoke. We're going to have more wildfires. The fact that we haven't had as much over the last 100 years is an anomaly. And that debt is coming paid due, essentially. So now when we do have wildfires, it's not sort of restorative, it's not low level, it's not sort of a limited period of smoke. It's a lot of smoke and has tremendous impacts beyond the smoke. So there's a lot of work going on in those communities around when you build houses, how can you make those houses more resilient to wildfires? So I think that is an active land use question as to whether or not there should be any development in those areas. But I think there's also a lot of work that can be done that can make those houses more resilient in the face of these episodic wildfire events. You know, so the question was, can you give us some hope? I think was the first question, which then it got more specific, which I hoped I provided some hope. But a specific example of where the management of forests have improved or been more resilient in the face of these obstacles. A common example that people give to me is in our past, we've had a number of board members from all over the world at the World Forestry Center, including from places like Norway and Finland, communities that still produce a tremendous amount of timber. They would describe they have a forestry culture. There is a larger discussion for those who are American Studies nerds to talk about why is it that sort of from a cultural standpoint, we treat farmers and foresters very differently, traditionally. In the case of Europe, foresters are sort of seen as sort of community beneficiary. They're people that benefit the community. They benefit the forest. They manage the forest. I think that they've made very specific decisions there around certain landscapes. You optimize those forests for certain uses. Certain landscapes, you're producing timber. That's a nursery. You don't manage that for sort of just ecological health. That you manage that for board feet coming off that property. And you make certain decisions to mitigate the ancillary impacts of managing that landscape that way. But you optimize that use for the landscapes that can do that. And then you have other areas where they provide, for example, water quality benefit. And you optimize the management of those forests for those uses. So that's sort of the example of that. I think the larger philosophical conversation here in the United States is our traditional history of sort of self-made frontiersmanship, and I think what we're grappling with here in the United States is how does that fit also with a community ethic and thinking about sort of the highest and best use for the greatest good, because we now have finite resources, right? So it's not 1850 anymore. In the case of forestry, it's not 1890. And I think that you can actually, if you look into that, for those that are history dorks, there's actually a lot of history of natural resources in the United States in which we've gone through this period, in particular periods, where all of a sudden we've had a realization of like, oh, we can't manage it that way. And then we adapt and we manage it better. I think we're due, especially around innovations around technology, to sort of reset our thinking around how we manage our forests, to the benefit of society and to the benefit of our forests. I'd say the biggest, if I do anything right in this job, it'd be that the World Forestry Center is able to engage that practical center in this conversation. I think a lot of forestry has been a polarized conversation.
That's correct.
That frankly most of society doesn't really pay attention to.
They don't.
Right? And so when those two are battling, they're like, I'm not, you guys take your feud and you go over there, I'm not really interested. The problem is that larger society is necessary to make the investment, whether it's creating opportunities for private investment or actual public dollars, in sort of the actions that we need for that resource. And so really I think the World Forestry Center's most essential role is to engage that practical center and bring them into the conversation and create the social will that supports that investment that our forests need. Thank you for the opportunity, I really appreciate it, and all have a good evening.